Let me introduce myself. I'm Roger Peterson. I'm the acting director of the Security Studies program this year. And I want to welcome you to the 19th MIT Senior Congressional and Executive Office Branch Seminar. And I'm looking at the program, and it looks like it's going to be a very interesting few days with a very timely topic. Hi, Dean Nobles. So before we get started, I want to introduce Professor Claude Canizares. He was a guiding force in the creation of this seminar, and he's going to say a few words. Just in way of background, Professor Canizares earned his BA, MA, PhD in physics from Harvard University, after which he came to MIT as a postdoctoral fellow and then joined the faculty. He served as director of the Center for Space Research, now the MIT Kavli Institute, the associate provost. He was vice president for research and associate provost, and he served as vice president of MIT from 2013 and 15. That's his sort of service credentials, his science credentials. Reading off his biography, Professor Canizares studies the properties of a wide range of galactic and extragalactic X-ray sources, including active stars, black hole or neutron star binaries, supernova remnants, quasars, clusters of galaxies. He also uses X-ray sources as probes of interstellar and intergalactic matter. I'm not sure if that science background helped you as a vice president or administrator, but it sounds like, certainly very interesting stuff. So as a reward for both service and science, Professor Canizares is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, International Academy of Astronautics, a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, on and on. He's also received several awards, including decoration for meritorious civilian service to the United States Air Force and 2 NASA Public Service Medals. So, Professor Canizares.
Well, thank you very much. That was a generous introduction for remarks that probably won't last much longer than the introduction. But I would, of course, like to start by welcoming all the participants in this seminar. Welcome to MIT on behalf of President Rafael Reif and the senior administration. This is the 19th such gathering, as you heard. The first was held nearly 25 years ago in 1994, and my colleague Gene Skolnikov of political science here and I began this series under the leadership of the then MIT president Chuck Vest, who had recently come to MIT and opened the Washington office, which many of you know because they're key logistics members of this seminar series and have been since the very beginning. The motivation in starting a series of seminars for senior staff was that many of the issues being addressed in Washington and at any given time we recognized had major science and technology components, but were had a strong intersection with policy. And so at any given time, there were, in fact, an abundance of potential topics to be explored that we thought could be of use. There was an experiment to the senior staff members who were actually wrestling with those problems in real time. We actually started by only inviting senior congressional staff. After it took 10 years of successful seminars to realize that we might be bold enough to actually mix 2 branches of government and bring some senior executive branch staff as well. In recent years, of course, the Security Studies program has assumed primary responsibility for conducting these seminars, and we're really grateful for them and for the philanthropy that makes it possible for them to do so. Our aim in doing these, as I say, was to try to pick an important topic and to then explore that in some depth, more so than I know the typical sort of short snippet of information that you can deal with during a busy day on the Hill or in your agencies. And the hope was that by doing so outside the Beltway with a limited group of people in the relative calm of the spring recess would be a way to really foster exchange of information and discussion and dialogue, not just one-way transmission of information. Initially, we picked topics that were on or just coming over the distant horizon rather than those that are under active consideration at the time. So we started, for example, I think our first seminar was the future of the Internet, and that was at a time when there were only a few thousand websites and maybe a million computers on the Internet compared to the billions that are here now. So we try to anticipate things that might be disruptive going forward. Other topics included the rise of genomics very early in the Human Genome Project, future of transportation, and advanced manufacturing before it was a buzz phrase. But over time, we risked dealing with topics that were more in the foreground. We actually did one on energy and climate right around the time of the Kyoto Protocol, for example. Well, I, for one, but I think we all might wish that this year's topic were further away on the distant horizon rather than in the foreground staring us in the face. But in fact, as Roger said, it could not be more timely. So I'm sure you are all eager to get on with it. And I think I've taken up just about as much time as the introduction did now. So I will close by giving you, again, a warm welcome, and especially also to thank my colleagues and our distinguished guests who are participating as presenters and discussants in this symposium. And I wish you an interesting and active time over the next 3 days. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. It's great to see all of you here today on this typically warm spring day in Boston. I hope you dressed appropriately. I'm Jim Walsh at the Security Studies Program, and I want to introduce our lunchtime speaker. Let me begin first by expressing my profound gratitude to all the people who helped make this seminar happen, the faculty, the staff, and all of you who have taken time out of your recess, a potential vacation, to come up here to Cambridge. But in particular, I want to express my thanks to my good friend Alan and to the Frankel Family Foundation. We would not be having this event if it were not for them, period. And so this is absolutely critical, and I'm glad Alan can be here. My only regret is that my dear friends Ray and Max couldn't make the trip from California, but I know Ray would be very excited to be here for this particular topic. And so we will certainly follow up with him. We have a terrific lineup of panels and speakers. It starts really strong, and then it just keeps on going from there. And case in point is Rebecca Hersman, our lunchtime speaker. Rebecca is director of the Project on Nuclear Issues, or PONI, as we call it, and it is a prestigious program of CSIS. It's one of the most innovative programs on nuclear issues that I'm aware of. And among its many projects, certainly one of the most important is its effort to build the next generation of nuclear experts with programs that support early and mid-career scholars and analysts. Now, previously, Rebecca served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for countering weapons of mass destruction. She was also an International Affairs Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and a Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But by far, her most important job, at least as it relates to you, my friends, was she once served as a staffer on the House Armed Services Committee. In short, she has walked in your shoes, and as Bill Clinton said, she feels your pain. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Rebecca Hersman.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's my first time up to MIT, and what a great location, what a terrific program. Thank you, Jim, and the whole team here at MIT. It's quite, I think, quite an excellent program you have in front of you. Yeah, it's funny thinking back to the years when you're a brand new Hill staffer. That was a long time ago. We maybe don't have to identify the year, but I will say that Les Aspin was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee back then. And so it was really, but I would say it was the most incredible experience to be with so many young, talented people who went on to amazing roles and responsibilities. You had like Deborah Lee James, who became Secretary of the Air Force. She was on the staff at that time. You had people like Nora Slack and Alice Marion, who became Deputy Comptroller. We had Jim Miller, who was working there at the time, Rudy De Leon. I mean, people who've gone on and had terrific careers. And I got to be like the youngster chasing them around and trying to get their attention, help me figure out how to actually write an amendment for a bill. So it's fun to think back on those days, and exciting for some of you who are kind of doing those things. It's heady times. So one of the things that I liked a lot about the agenda that you have, and I'm actually going to see if I can. No, I'll turn sideways. One of the things I really liked about your agenda is that it has a lot of focus on what I would call context. The idea-making part of policymaking is really important but insufficient. Process, roles and responsibilities, resourcing, and politics very much set the frame in which policy must be developed and implemented. And I think you have that represented in your agenda, and I applaud that. I was asked to kind of try to give you a bit of a scene setter on U.S. nuclear policy, deterrence, and the state of the nuclear enterprise. And so I'm going to try to lay that out in a few ways. I'm hoping we can have time for a lot of dialogue on Q&A, and I'll put a marker that we're here to talk nuclear, but I'm happy to talk about other things in the WMD space as well if you're interested. And there is no time I will not climb on a soapbox about the use of chemical weapons, so feel free to go there. But let me just say this. I have one simple bottom line up front for you that I think represents this talk. It is a very dangerous world out there, but all too often we are our own worst enemy. And that's kind of the bottom line. Now, what do I mean by that? What I want to do is talk about 5 mistakes. I could make it 10, but we would be here all day. But 5 mistakes that I sure would love it if we could avoid making, because I think they're critical to having a credible deterrence posture supported by a healthy and effective nuclear enterprise. And I think in a way they give you some good food for thought as you continue to engage the topics over the next few days, but also in the days, weeks, and months ahead when you return to your jobs and try to think, I'll try not to make that mistake or let my boss make it. So here we go. Mistake number 1 is getting crushed between the rock and the hard place. We're going to talk about North Korea. North Korea's mounting nuclear and missile capabilities, aggressive regional posturing, and erratic behavior pose the classic policymaker's dilemma. When all of the options are bad, doing nothing looks good. Max Fisher referred to this in a New York Times piece just on Monday, kind of called it the no good option paradox. And I would say it kind of leads to freezing. We tend to freeze when all the options are bad and we just stand there. But in that case, this dynamic got us to a really much maligned policy of strategic patience. Now, we know the Vice President declared the end of strategic patience last week in Seoul, but the alternative to strategic patience is still not very clear. We are still faced with an aggressive, risk-tolerant, nuclear-armed adversary actively seeking to expand its nuclear and missile programs in ways that pose a direct threat to the United States and its allies. And the path to safety, the escape route from the out in between the rock and the hard place, remains very, very unclear. So why? On the one hand, we have the rock. The United States can seek to amp up military pressure on North Korea. We can ratchet up our deterrence threats, enhance strike capabilities in the face of missile threats, and hope that coercion and the threat of force will compel the Kim Jong-un regime to exercise restraint and slow its missile and nuclear and missile delivery programs. But we need to accept in this case that the chance that our bluff will be called runs very high. The military options are not appealing, and the risks to our allies and troops are very substantial. In the end, the pressure to avoid the next Korean War will be enormous. So on the other hand, we have the hard place. The United States can seek to engage North Korea diplomatically. We can attempt to negotiate some kind of freeze in the nuclear program or cap missile capabilities and ranges or testing. But the fact is, the United States has a very limited hand to play. No one that I know of realistically believes that denuclearization is possible at this point. Any overt acceptance of North Korea's nuclear weapons capability, though, would still be seen as a catastrophic blow to the nuclear nonproliferation regime and a fatal assault on U.S. credibility, as successive presidents have said that a nuclear-armed North Korea is unacceptable. Honestly, I think this path would make the Iran nuclear deal look like child's play in comparison. So it's hard to imagine that path. But in reality, would picking either of these bad options be the mistake that does the most harm? I'm still going to say no. The mistake is convincing ourselves that the space between the rock and the hard place, where we now sit, will do anything but shrink, and that somehow the options will be less bad tomorrow than they are today. In reality, the space between the rock and the hard place rarely, if ever, grows with time. This situation has reached the critical point and requires active management, even if it cannot be fixed. And this will require some degree of risk-taking and a lot of leadership, one direction or the other, on our part. It appears today that the Trump administration is inclined to pick the rock. This may be what the situation requires, but the rock is actually a really large and very dangerous boulder. And the best we can hope for is that the rock builds pressure, especially within China, for a pivot to the hard place. At the end of the day, in my opinion, negotiations backed by the real and credible threat of force are unpalatable, but offer the best chance of protecting the United States and its allies and escaping the trap in which we find ourselves today. Okay, we can come back to that. I know you have Bob Grommel here in the audience who knows more about North Korea than almost anyone, so we can have a dialogue about that. But before we go there, let's talk about mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is missing the boat. In a world of complex and what appear to be expanding nuclear dangers, it can be very difficult to perceive and then focus on the truly important. We often get distracted by the shiny object, or as my son likes to say to me, kind of do the "oh, squirrel," and look aside the other way. We tend also to apply narrow, siloed thinking to complex, dynamic problems. And for those of us inside the nuclear community, we tend to look for nuclear solutions, to nuclear problems, and we kind of take a functional lens, while our regional friends are taking all of a regional lens, and we're not very good at putting those two lenses together to figure out how to look at this. So in those cases, we miss forest for trees, or in my case, and this I would say, we miss the boat. So I'm talking about our nuclear policy challenges with Russia. And I'm going to take a little bit of a poll in a minute. I'm going to guess that the vast majority of you are at least generally aware and somewhat knowledgeable about Russia's provocative stance on NATO's periphery, its nuclear brandishing, its provocative exercises, and its supposed escalate to de-escalate doctrine. You may have noticed the chest-thumping Russian responses to enhanced defensive posture in NATO and the deployment of missile defenses in Europe, and probably have concluded, as have I, the relatively dim prospects for arms control in the years ahead. And you have several speakers, Amy Wolf and others, who will talk to this topic, and we can get into it in Q&A. But I'd like to ask you a bit about a different part of the Russia problem, because I think these transgressions in some ways are luring our attention away from some other, perhaps even more dramatic strategic plays that the Russians have underway. It appears that Russia has set its sights on strategic domination of the North, and they are so far ahead of anyone else that it's not evident if, when, or how we will actually ever be able to close that gap. The Arctic used to be a no-go zone, especially from the perspective of looking at our nuclear posture, US nuclear posture around the globe. We could sort of write that off. It was largely, and has been even today, irrelevant for the continuous anytime, anywhere requirements of our sea-based deterrent. With sea ice coverage declining at rapid rates, however, this no-go zone will be, no more, and the United States is very poorly positioned to contend in that area. Russia, on the other hand, has invested heavily in a militarized Arctic, has built 6 military bases north of the Arctic Circle in a clear attempt to dominate the increasingly navigable region. Russia has a new Arctic command, 4 new Arctic Brigade combat teams, 14 new operational airfields, and 16 deep water ports. How many of you knew all that? Okay. How much of Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent is deployed in the Arctic? Guess? Okay, not quite all. They do manage to get a few other places. Guess? Oh, come on. Higher. 80%. More than 80% of Russia's sea-based nuclear weapons are deployed in the Arctic. How many, maybe you know this one. This has been an issue on the Hill, so I'm going to take a guess. How many icebreakers, operationally available icebreakers, does Russia have? At least 40. How many are in process? 11. The rest of the world, they're so far ahead of the rest of the world, we're not even close. Okay, how many does the US have? Good. All right. That's progress. I usually get, stares on that question, too. Yep, we have one. We have 2. We only have 1 that's currently operational, and we've just signed a contract to bring 1 on in the mid-2020s. So in a recent article, Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska is quoted as saying, "The highways of the Arctic are icebreakers. Russia has superhighways, and we have dirt roads and potholes." Russia's strategic nuclear presence in the region has many of our Northern European allies paying attention, and it stands to sharply readjust the global posture with regard to deterrence. And I don't think we are really even beginning to think about that in the ways that we need to. So we need to be careful not to miss the boat. Okay, number 3. Mistake number 3 is using hardware solutions for software problems. So my daughter has been recovering for almost 3 months now from a concussion, from a strange, just accidental fall. And some months ago, I went to the doctor, and I kind of sat there as a mom would do when your kid's been having this problem that you just can't explain, and why isn't it getting better? And I'm like, shouldn't we do an MRI? What about a CAT scan? Isn't there something with answers? And he looked at me and he said, "You are trying to put a hardware solution on a software problem. A concussion is a soft brain tissue problem. You can't see it with these things. And you're missing, you're applying the wrong solution to the problem. So we're going to have to do different things to understand what's happening." Well, we do that all the time, right? We do that in lots of things. And we certainly do it in nuclear policy. Nuclear experts routinely stress that deterrence is a function of capability, our nuclear weapons, delivery systems, command and control systems. This is our hardware. But also our credibility, our confidence, and that of our allies and adversaries that the United States will choose to use these capabilities when needed to defend against and respond to the gravest threats. This is our software side of the equation, okay? Credibility really is about software. It is our big challenge in deterrence, right? It's our ability to persuade any potential adversary that the costs of conflict with the United States or our allies, particularly nuclear conflict, will exceed any benefit, and therefore restraint is the only viable course of action. But these are software problems. It's the problems in communicating. It's the problems in our confidence that we're being understood as intended. It's problems in understanding the potential adversary, of which we now have multiples. So we have multiple software problems, and the value systems that drive their decision-making. There are problems in U.S. credibility, and there are even problems in our decision-making processes, but these are not really hardware problems. Our nuclear capabilities, our warheads, delivery systems, command and control, and others, this hardware has to set the floor. It's the foundation of credible deterrence for sure. But alone, the hardware is wholly insufficient and will not resolve any of these software problems. So what's a good example of this? This would be sort of the current debate over low-yield nuclear weapons and so-called limited nuclear war, right? This really gets you right at the tension point between hardware and software, and are you applying the right types of problems? Russia has implied that it may consider using lower-yield, limited-effect nuclear weapons as a means to terminate a conventional conflict in their favor. Where do we go? We get fixated on whether or not we have the right low-yield weapons to counter that kind of doctrine. I can't help but look at Amy over here, right? Do you think that's our problem? No. Our problem is not that we don't have enough low-yield nuclear weapons to deal with that, or at least it's way down the list. The problem is, how do we communicate our intentions? How is our credibility perceived? All very real things, but they won't be solved by, mixing up which types of, nuclear weapons or bringing a new nuclear weapon online. That really stands to be a distraction. This is not unrelated to mistake number 4. Mistake number 4 is overplaying the hand. The nuclear policy world is a terribly polarized world, with nuclear deterrence community on the one hand and the arms control nonproliferation community on the other. Win-win solutions seem pretty elusive, and it's largely a zero-sum game in the world of nuclear policy. For much of the last 8 years, the arms controllers were perceived as ascendant. Today, the nuclear deterrence community feels the wind in its sails. Some of us, very few of us, who try to occupy the tiny little space known as the moderate middle, spend a lot of time by ourselves. Now, the excitement in the nuclear deterrence world is palpable. They are pretty excited. Defense budgets are on the rise. The president is emphasizing the need for nuclear capabilities at the top of the pack. A Republican Congress seems perched to support strong defense and a fully modernized triad of nuclear delivery and command and control systems. We've seen pretty strong support from our allies and those who come under the nuclear umbrella, and a focus on those types of issues that is far different, even in NATO, far more robust conversation about nuclear weapons and nuclear policy than there's been for decades. So the situation, I would argue, to all of my good friends in the nuclear deterrence world, is that it is ripe for the classic mistake of the overplayed hand. There is a consensus that favors nuclear modernization and a reinvigoration of the importance of deterrence as a foundational element of a credible nuclear strategy, both domestically and internationally, and I would argue of the role of that inside a broader national security strategy. But that consensus is fragile, brittle, and no less vulnerable from the right than it is from the left. So the analogy, you've probably already picked up, I am way overused analogies. So the consensus is really like one of those Jenga games, right? You've got that game with all the blocks that are sort of built up in the middle, and everybody's supposed to walk up and pull a block out, right? Okay, so this modernization, consensus on the modernization of US nuclear deterrent is really like one of these Jenga games. You build up the blocks and then you go in and pull it out. But here's the problem. It doesn't matter, whether you pull pieces from the right or the left. The blocks are still going to fall. It doesn't matter either way. So the arms control and global zero communities, I would argue, got a taste of this reality when the Obama administration committed to a robust modernization plan as part of the successful ratification of New START, a plan that included a major modernization of all 3 legs of the nuclear triad, as well as the new long-range air-launched cruise missile and the recapitalization of the command and control system. So they encountered this challenge of running into the middle. The middle got protected. Last summer, there was a major revisiting of key elements of that modernization plan, along with reconsideration of several other key aspects of nuclear policy, including a fairly controversial relook at no first use, which also collapsed in on itself, in part out of a recognition of the need to protect, we just couldn't afford more blocks out of the game, right? So that was a huge factor. Well, now the pendulum is swinging to the other side, I would argue, but the risks associated with radicalizing our nuclear policy agenda remain regardless. Sustaining a credible and analytically sound modernization program, despite what will be a very painful bow wave to come, is critically important. Success will depend on maintaining the consensus, and the consensus will continue to be absolutely critical. So when we start to look at issues that will pull a block out, such as renewed nuclear testing, new lower yield nuclear weapons, walking away from New START, any appearance of aggravating an arms race, I feel confident, and I think you should too, that those are blocks that are going to come out of the Jenga game and it will fall. So we're going to find ourselves having to try to protect this fragile consensus, and that will mean fending off radicalization of our overall nuclear policy from either side, and that will not change. So finally, that's going to take me to the last one of the mistakes. And this mistake, I think, may not apply to you as much, but I think you will recognize it. It's falling into the echo chamber. Again, that nuclear community I talked about, for it's very polarized, it's also very insular. Okay? It is a community, the nuclear community absolutely loves to talk to itself. It's incredible. There's nobody they would rather talk to than someone that looks like them, walks like them, talks like them. You can go to one of these meetings, and please don't take any offense, but it's a sea of somewhat hair-deprived, older white men. Pretty much like across the board. Yeah, you're not even old enough. You've hit a couple other marks, but you're just like not even old enough. So it's incredible. They've known each other for 40 years. They just all talk to each other. I mean, you're like, little old me is like knocking at the door, and they pat me on the head like I'm a kid. I'm 52 years old, for heaven's sakes. It's unbelievable. So it's gotten to a point where they look alike, talk alike, think alike. They use their own vocabulary. They speak their own language, and they continuously project an air of exclusivity, elitism, and intellectualism. It is not called the nuclear priesthood for nothing, right? It is, we take name dropping to like a whole new level. You can't get through a conversation without Schelling, Jervis Kahn, it's like becomes just a joke almost. There's so much name dropping. It's a high art. And frankly, the arms control isn't much better. They don't get off. It is the same thing. We are the snobbiest community that exists in foreign policy. Amy, you're laughing. Is it true? Okay. So it's amazing. We thrive on our own geekiness. We cherish our club member status, and then without fail, we bemoan the state of the national conversation about nuclear weapons. It never fails. That is the punchline at the end every time. And you kind of look and go, wonder why? So let me remind you of a few things. Fully 1/3 of the United States population was born after the Cold War ended. In fact, most of you, at least a chunk of you, were born after the Cold War ended. Members of this generation have no experience with and little knowledge of the threats that shape our security environment for nearly 50 years and the defining role played by nuclear deterrence in keeping the peace. The language, experience, and concepts of the Cold War do not resonate with this community. They do not inspire that generation, and they are consumed with other issues that feel real and present in a way that this does not. During the Cold War, nuclear dangers loomed large and figured prominently in the public discourse. Civil defense efforts like Duck and Cover ensured that Americans knew that the fear of nuclear weapons, even as we survived that entire period, they were aware of it, even as we survived, by deterring their actual use. And the reality is that nothing has emerged, either nationally or internationally, to re-explain deterrence in contemporary terms that address the world of today and tomorrow rather than that of yesterday. Look at the way we describe things, to highlight a couple of, most of us who are equipped with experience and knowledge to talk about nuclear policy, we do it with all focused on a very high strategic logic. We focus on concepts and jargon, hedge, strategic stability, escalation, that are routinely not explained or defined, and they're reinterpreted by audiences as they're listening to them. I talked about the elitism and exclusivity. But there is also this assumption inside the establishment, which has gotten a pretty big rebuke over the last year, that we tend to assume that others will prioritize or even take an interest in nuclear issues as we do. And that is simply not true. We forget that when we policy elites look at a security environment with rising nuclear powers and the threat of miscalculation and the sustained importance of deterrence, and that's the world we see, that others see a very different picture, that many around the world, and indeed many in this country, they see today's nuclear dangers when they're juxtaposed against a world of unprecedented level of political upheaval, displacement, human suffering. They see our nuclear worries as either unlikely and long gone since the fall of the Berlin Wall, or in fact, a threat for which the United States and its allies actually bears the blame. That is how much is perceived. And if you look at an issue that we could get into, the rapid escalation of the humanitarian movement inside the broader nuclear domain in terms of internationally, and moving all the way now to negotiations on a ban treaty, it is important to understand the underlying motivation of that is a strong belief by many of those proponents that we are in fact the problem. We are the problem that needs to get fixed. Not even Russia. They give up on Russia. We're the problem. And that is a very different way of looking at things, but it's shoes we need to learn how to walk in and understand if we're actually going to advance the security interests associated with nuclear weapons. So, not maybe a very happy picture. Usually people who work on WMD and nuclear stuff are not the good news, happy lunch speakers, but hopefully some food for thought, and I'd love to hear your ideas about how we could have a more productive national conversation about nuclear weapons and what you're hearing in your respective environments on these issues, and whether any of my mistakes resonate. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
You better not be this shy, because we got 3 days ahead of us.
You didn't mention, or other favorite problems, which is India-Pakistan. And doing some work on this, I tend to be more frightened about what might happen there, especially as both militaries move to deploying weapons on ships in the Indian Ocean, which would mean that it would be the launch capability, not the authority. Any thoughts at all about where that fits into your 5 sins that we've committed?
I put it in a positive way. Don't do this and we'll be fine. No. So I totally agree that that is one of the most serious threats we face in the overall nuclear policy domain. It is probably also in many ways one of the most frustrating in that it isn't so much about us. And so that sort of makes it hard for us to feel like we can kind of manage or control that in a reasonable way. But I will give one point that I think we need to think more about, and we could talk all day about it, but I think you have other good speakers who will be able to address. But here's one that I'd like you to talk with them about. One thing I heard and have been thinking about in the India-Pakistan challenge is, and it was something that Firuz Khan raised at one point in a session I did with him. It was the dependence of both, or assumption, that both India and Pakistan would turn to the international community, but in particular the United States, to provide an off-ramp in the event of an escalating tension. And thinking about how profoundly destabilizing that actually is. Here we are, we're here to help, but actually really destabilizing, right? Because if you believe you're going to get an external off-ramp, then you can afford to be more provocative. At least if you think of traditional deterrence and escalation and stability between the United States and Russia, or then the former Soviet Union, there was nobody who was going to come, pull the off-ramp up, and help us down. We knew that was only within ourselves. I worry that India or Pakistan at different points imagine that, somebody's going to show up with that off-ramp and they can afford to take risks that they would otherwise moderate more because there would be they are in charge all the way to the end. So that creates interesting questions about what do we do, how do we engage, and how do we kind of manage that. I don't have an answer on that, but I think it's a really important question that I don't hear talked about enough. There was a question over here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll speak up for the millennials here. I was born in 1987, so just getting barely into the Cold War. And I think it's great that you recognize that. I mean, a lot of people in the newer generation are thinking about these things very fundamentally different. Because when you're speaking about the Arctic, I was thinking like, well, this is really Cold War mentality that a lot of the nuclear community is excited that there's a resurgent Russia, that you're back into the old framework. But it seems that, from our perspective, that we've really been doing a lot to provoke Russia. I mean, by tearing up the ABM treaty, marching NATO up to its borders, and that we do see that problem. So I guess the question is, why should we be concerned about Russia putting nuclear submarines in the Arctic and doing these moves? I don't see that changes anyway the fundamental fact that there's second strike capability in nuclear deterrence. So why should we be angry at these provocations and see Russia as the problem?
Specifically on the Arctic issue?
Yeah, sure, we can talk about the Arctic. I mean, is it that they're going to seize these mineral resources and that then, they're going to somehow dominate the West economically, or?
So what I think is interesting, I mean, I think, again, obviously the larger stakes in the Arctic are fundamentally economic, and in terms of, what is sort of the future of sort of these global relations and movement around the globe, what will that look like in the decades ahead? I think what's challenging, what's concerning to me, because I don't consider myself, as I say, I consider myself pretty moderate on these issues, but it is concerning to me to perceive such an overwhelming imbalance that would put the United States at risk of a lot of kind of coercive tactics. Most of the time we think of managing stability in terms of some degrees of parity, and that parity hopefully kind of pulling some of those issues off the table so that, for example, the economic issues could come to the fore in the Arctic. So it does concern me to see such dramatic imbalance there. Does that mean that, they don't have legitimate perceptions of risk and security? Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of, I'm not suggesting any of those are irrational, but I do think we've been incredibly, as a country in our foreign policy and our national security policy, have been deeply focused, almost obsessed, on the NATO periphery. And you'll hear lots of talk about, oh my gosh, Russia's about to invade the Baltics, or I find gets very hyped up, that I'm not sure I think that Russia's risk tolerance is that low. And then I'm watching this other area where I think the upper hand is so firmly established that I worry about the dynamics of that in the future. Yeah.
Just to pick up the way we study these things at MIT, there's one school that puts the emphasis about world politics on sort of the polarity of the system. So one of the problems of the Cold War was a bipolar system, and this is just the way you thought about things with bipolarity. Then the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have unipolarity, and we talk about how a hegemon sort of creates a world like that. And now we're talking about moving into a more multipolar system. So do these things still resonate? Should we be thinking about the international system in terms of polarity in this, or are there opportunities that are beyond this? And is this the problem with all these old Cold War guys, that they're thinking in just their conceptual framework is not helpful?
So one part of my short answer is I'm not sure. And the other part is that Barry's apparently studying this in great detail. I was hearing about it at lunch. So Barry can probably really dive into that. I am very much a policymaker type. That's my background, right? I am not, nearly as academically credentialed as many of you. So I kind of am about what do you actually feel when you engage in policy. One of the things I feel like I've lived in kind of the practical effects of that dynamic is when you have these imbalances, how do all of us as nations and as decision makers who are actually, that live in nations, how do we perceive risk? And one of the things, and this goes back in part to like the North Korea thing in a very strong way. When you are the disadvantaged actor, the one that perceives that your place in the world is not correct, you really become much less, you become more risk tolerant because you're unhappy with your status quo and you're willing to do things. Russia, North Korea, and so forth, right? Their risk tolerance is clearly different than ours. The United States has one of the things about kind of sitting at the top for a while is we've become incredibly risk averse. We don't want anything to change. We're nervous about making things worse. And I've watched us take it to kind of extreme small issues, so North Korean provocations, do we dare deploy X or respond Y or continue with an exercise, or, and we become incredibly self-restraining, self-censoring because we're so worried about tipping the risk somehow. That's very real. And it's legitimate, but it also kind of freezes you in place in ways that can be really challenging. So I'm not quite sure how, like Barry, you would link that to the broader theory, but for me, that's the very practical effect that affects decision-making when you have these imbalances. I do, yeah.
And I'll remain quiet.
Bob.
Thank you. I'll stand up here so everybody can hear me. First, thanks for your kind words. There are other people here in the room I know that know more about North Korea than I do to Boston. So anyway, I'm wondering how you would characterize the situation that we're in right now. We clearly are at an inflection point with North Korea in the sense that they are about to acquire nuclear capability that they haven't had before, that can put the United States and CONUS at great risk. The question then becomes, is that permissible, and how do we address that threat? On the one hand, it seems as though the administration is taking this in a more aggressive, taking a more aggressive stance, not quite putting down the red lines regarding ICBM deployment, but nonetheless suggesting that that's intolerable. And I guess the question I have for you is that really intolerable to the point where we have to take the risk of war or conflict or escalation, or looking back at the history that we've talked about with the Soviets, deterrence actually worked for 50 years. And so is that where we're getting now at this point? Is it a choice between taking
very high risks of damage to Seoul and possibly a second Korean War, or living with a nuclear North Korea capable of hitting the United States as we did with the Soviets, and doing it by way of successful deterrence.
Yeah. I think what's really challenging, Bob, about that question is those are, in fact, two sides of the same coin. If you want to say, I'm going to take a stronger deterrence orientation to North Korea, you have to find a way to say, I'm demonstrating something different than what you felt before, right? You, North Korea, need to feel something different that I'm, going to respond in a way that you will not like if you do something like this, and you're going to understand it, and it's going to feel different from the suit you wore yesterday, right? So how do you do that? You're going to have to do something. You have to either signal, talk, declaratory policy, respond at lower echelons of conflict to see if you have to do something. And the challenge we face is at which one of those things that we pick, walks the razor's edge of sending the deterrence message without provoking. And those deterrence messages slide right up to then this question of preventive, preemptive action, right? That's like when you sit at the knife's edge, I think it's kind of right there. So that will go to what is the state with our allies, and what kind of judgments are we prepared to make? How much do we believe we understand this adversary, and what will influence his thinking? And that's really difficult in this case. But what I will say is that one way or another, whether it's hard place, negotiations, anything else, or on the deterrence military side, or a weaving of the two together in a highly coercive negotiating strategy, which is kind of what I favor, the risk of that something goes wrong is not lost on me. I just think we're stuck, and that is what we're going to have to do. We are going to have to take a risk tolerance that we are uncomfortable with and try to move it up, because I don't see another option. That's just, Rebecca's view. I'm sorry, did I miss a hand? Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to your Jenga metaphor and ask you about the one of your three examples that surprised me. I've heard a lot about low yield, and there's awareness that that's a sensitive issue that can hurt the consensus. I've heard a little bit about New START either withdrawing from it or not renewing it. But going back to explosive testing surprised me. I had not heard that was something that was under more discussion than it ever had been under the same constituencies. And there's not a constituency for it among the national labs, as far as I know. So I was just wondering if you could talk more about where that's coming from and what the actual risks and vulnerabilities of that are.
I think you're right that one is a little bit, on the sliding scale of things. I think that one is more solidly out of the way. But I'm not sure. It is definitely, people are talking about it. And the problem becomes that and new, any type of new warhead becomes linked with, do you need new testing? Those two are kind of linked up. So there are some people who are trying to argue, yes, we need, kind of different tailored weapons. And yeah, I think we'll be able to do it without testing. But then the tester folks come back and are like, no, you can't. So I think that's where it will become very tricky. So they're definitely proponents of kind of reconsidering the testing moratorium. They will get more energy if we find there's a lot of pressure to look at new nuclear weapons or dramatically reconfigured. The other area where the testing comes up just has to do more with their technological hedge, and to what extent are we trading certain types of risks in the near term versus the longer term. And those arguments are not irrational. I mean, there's a logic that says, we're clinging to testing in different ways, or others may. So, but those are the others, a little bit longer term, and they have more to do with how you age the stockpile, and is that smart? Even though it can be certified, and the lab directors are certifying, and they speak very confidently about their belief of the highly effective nature of stockpile stewardship. But if you fundamentally change the stockpile, that will change dynamics in stockpile stewardship. All right. They look ready to move on. So Barry, did you want to jump on polarity?
Well, my thinking is a work in progress, but I want to connect some of my thinking to a particular point you made, which I think is very difficult. Your problem with hardware and software solutions, particularly in the realm of deterrence, particularly in the realm of understanding the opponent. Whether we use the term multipolarity or some less theoretical concept, the intelligence community has been using a concept, diffusion of power, which at least carries the implication that whether or not we face a world of equals, we face a world where there could be 6, 8, 10 countries that are sufficiently capable that they make us stop and think. And that was intimated, you intimated that in your discussion of hardware versus software, all the different countries that one would need to understand in order to implement a software solution. Now, it's my perception that we've never been very good at this, that the number of countries we have to understand has gone up.
Right.
And if you look at our system as a whole, and here I include both government and academia, our efforts to invest in that side of things, in area studies, is pretty poor. Now, I've tried arguing this among policy people, and their eyes kind of glaze over, but I don't get good reactions. For example, take the intelligence community. The intelligence community on the whole has been given over to targeting in the last 15 years. That's what they do. They look for people to shoot at, or they look for warning that somebody's getting ready to shoot at us. Right? Small, large, whatever it is. Right? Huge emphasis on SIGINT, huge emphasis on listening into people's communications, processing it, looking for that. Right? But where are the particular area experts being trained that can pull that stuff together? State Department. It's been a hardy perennial in the policy studies community. Let's reorganize the State Department. And one year somebody recommends some things, somebody else. State Department, if you just look at the organization, the organizational structure, it doesn't look like the foreign ministry. It looks like a real government. It's highly functional, right? Highly functional. And the regions, actually, I think, have been short-circuited. And I think the Foreign Service has been short-circuited. Now, this is not special pleading. I have no stake in any of this. I just for an article someone asked me to do, I just did a tour of our zone through the structure and kept scratching my head going, it seems uniquely mismatched to the world that you described. So I'm not only asking a question to her, there's a lot of people with a lot of experience in this room, and I hope this will come up later in the meeting. How do you assess, on the basis of your experience, my critical observations about the state of our system for solving the problem that you outlined in this software-hardware tension?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, and I'm going to take the opportunity that comment makes to beat on one of my favorite problems. I think even in the politically polarized world that is Washington, and we think of the big divide being between Republicans and Democrats, in policy world, I think that is still secondary to what many of us have felt is the ultimate big divide, and that is between regionalists and functionalists. The whole world, the entire, Paul, right? Have you lived this? You're in a functional office, right? Yeah. So they are like worlds unto themselves. They don't like to commingle. It is dreadful. And trying to get those people all in the same room to work on a particular problem is incredibly difficult. And that is just a practical, how to hold a meeting. It is so difficult. And I'll give you a very particular example going back to the IC. So this is ironic, and I won't be able to get into too much detail, but going all the way back to 2011, I called a big meeting in my office, and I was asking about the Syrian chemical weapons program, okay? And I was watching a lot of things that were very concerning. And this is before the sort of the war breaks out. This is all before this, 2010, 2011. I'll just say, you know, we were still looking at one of the most active chemical weapons programs in the world at that time, right? So I call this meeting and I have this, you know, kind of round table of intelligence experts. And they went through everything they knew, and I'm like, and I called it the pile of dots problem. They brought in all this information. It was incredible. I mean, there's really been few things that we've had more information about things that had been going on. But it was all, in my kind of capability, it was all capability based. It was all, you know, we think they have this, we think they don't have that, this is the, you know, here, this is what they do. It was all on the functional side. And so I asked the question, why are they doing this? They were doing some very specific things. Why are they doing this? What's the reason? Why do they really have this program? And I got this one-line facile answer of, you know, well, it's all about Israel. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. They're doing A, B, and C, which serves no purpose in that. Why? And I got this following answer, no kidding. I don't know, ma'am. We don't do intent. And I said, what do you mean you don't do intent? This was still kind of early on, and I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, there was a room full of experts. We don't do intent. I'm like, who does intent? Oh, the regionals do intent. We only do capability. I'm like, can I talk to an intent person now? Oh, no, you have to call a separate meeting for them. I'm dead serious. That actually happened. It earned a bit of a rant out of me, but I mean, that was for real. In the intelligence community, all the intent assessments are on the regional side. In the WMD world that I've lived in, fabulous community of committed experts. I mean, I loved my analysts, don't get me wrong. They were fantastic. I have all the respect in the world for my DIA analysts, but they are not allowed to analyze intent. They are not allowed to do the quote-unquote regionalist job. So we don't fuse there. So, you know, it happens in the intelligence community. It happens whether you're an OSD, the regionals meet over here. Who goes to the big meetings? Always on the regional side. Same thing at the State Department. Who's where in the pecking order? It's the regionals, and then the functionals are on the side. You know, it's a war zone between the two. I'm a functionalist, as you can tell, so I've had to, you know, had my knuckles bloodied many times. This is a very, very serious problem, that you cannot make these communities actually collaborate. And it's a deep and pervasive problem. Sorry, I'll get off the soapbox now. Anyone else? Yeah.
You had mentioned a no first use policy in the debate last summer. This was a debate that came up in my office quite a bit, and we were struggling to think of a scenario in which you might want to use a nuclear strike against a conventional attack, or without an imminent threat of a nuclear attack. I'd appreciate if you could kind of help clarify that argument from the other side. Is it kind of a theory to help, you know, settle allies in the region, particularly in Asia? You know, just to help flesh out that argument a bit. Thank you.
Sure. And it is a pretty big, complicated question, and I'm gonna make one kind of a process, because I do think process matters on that, and then maybe just start the conversation about what might be some arguments against it, because it's a pretty challenging issue. When talking about, though, opposing a revision to the no first use policy, as was considered late last summer, my number one objection at the time was on the process side first. We needed, you know, we were taking a sharp redirection in a short-circuited process at the end of an administration. I say this as a person who is a loyal supporter of the administration and someone who was in it for 6 years, so I'm not saying that as an opposition element, okay? But we had been through the NPR, we had done these things, we had communicated them, we had communicated with our allies, and we suddenly seemed to be kind of skipping past a lot of that with what would feel like a last-minute late fait accompli in ways where the process was not managed in a transparent way. It clearly had the pretty vocal opposition of the key cabinet members, and it was not ripe for a successful outcome, either in terms of what would happen with it in a follow-on NPR, which any new president, Republican or Democrat, would want to do. And so it just really felt not the right way to proceed on something that's perceived as that important. On the substance, it really is challenging because yes, it is difficult to imagine a range of situations where the United States would continue to want to use a nuclear weapon in a situation where we imagine we are the dominant power, right? We're the dominant conventional power, which is not the normal logic that would trigger that need. I think the fundamental concern in particular is not what does it do to our decision making. The question becomes, what does it do to the decision-making of our adversaries? And that's where it becomes more complex. If we change the policy for some, I would argue, somewhat intangible benefit, what would we really get? And what would be the cost-benefit analysis of that, right? If you're gonna, we've had this same policy for a long time. If we change it, you wanna believe you're going to actually gain something for it. Most of the gains that are argued for in the change of that policy, that somehow this will finally make the non-proliferation NPT community happy, and they'll believe we're meeting our commitments under the NPT, and we're doing good work on disarmament, and they're going to pat us on the back and say good job. I probably sound skeptical of that. I am. I've just been to too many of those NPT meetings, and it just doesn't work that way. They pocket whatever gain and it moves on to the next thing, and that's natural. So I wouldn't overplay the benefit of that. Now, what's the potential downside? The downside is, does this create a perception among various potential adversaries that they have additional freedom of action to see where our lines are, and would they consider additional actions below our now perceived threshold? We don't know, but it's a risk. And what we don't want to do is in any way encourage adversaries that they have more freedom of maneuver against us at this point than they might have had before. And that, I think, is a real consideration. So for me, when I look at those pros and cons, I don't see enough gain on the one hand to offset the potential risk that an adversary may find a little more freedom of movement to do things that would put us in a pretty difficult position and could try very hard to cleave us from our allies, right? Are they going to float up to the line and try to break us from the allies because who will feel, what do you mean you didn't really have a nuclear umbrella here, as an example? So that, I think, becomes where it's very tense. But do I share the idea that it's very implausible, and we certainly want to make sure that the president always has non-nuclear options in any of those lesser scenarios? I would certainly endorse that.
We have time for one more question.
You want to put yours together?
Most of your discussion has focused on state actors. I was wondering if you could discuss whether what role nuclear policy has with non-state actors.
Okay. Do you want to tell me what yours was, and I'll try to roll? All right. Non-state actors. It's always so difficult because as we've looked at this problem and studied it and been advised by our intelligence community over years, I mean, I am persuaded that non-state actors are interested in and would seek to acquire a nuclear capability if they could. I think that we've done a much better job of, and this is helpful in the nuclear arena where you still have this kind of fissile material long pole in the acquisition process, and it's hard either to gather the material or to set up the processes, and that's a huge obstacle. as I look at the behavior of non-state actors in other WMD areas, I feel like I consistently see, to the extent they have interest in, for example, chem and bio, they almost always want to acquire organic capability rather than kind of steal things, break things, get inside the fence, and, you know, and kind of gather materials. And I think we've often over-focused on what I call the threat reduction or threat control part of the problem. They like to cook their own stuff, and that's very difficult still on the nuclear side. And if you look at the CW acquisition and things that have been going on with the Islamic State, they have kind of frankly proven my theory at least good enough that I'm sticking with it. So they tend to be dissuaded from some of these things that are too hard and are inclined to some of the lower tech options. But it's still, you know, again, it's such a dramatic problem, we have to focus on it. But I find when we look at their behavior and intent and acquisition processes, they're a little different than some of the way that we project thinking onto them in an acquisition process. Does that help?
Sir, we got time. Go ahead.
No, I'm just reflecting on your comments about the unique nature of the nuclear community, and you know, recognizing that we've just embarked on a new NPR. I'm wondering your thoughts on how much the machine drives boxes and a president. I could imagine, you mentioned the events of the last administration. I could imagine President Obama thinking, gosh, if I'd known how this worked from the beginning, he as a new president or any new president might ask some different questions and might give some different direction. So there's a need for a pretty sophisticated understanding of the process if you've got a goal in mind and want to achieve that goal. How much does the machine of evaluating these things box in policy?
Well, that's interesting. I can say in terms of what ultimately became the 2010 NPR, because I had some involvement in that, the president was pretty insistent. I mean, he did a few things that were, it's all where you stand, where you sit, right? I think there were people inside the 2010 NPR, let's say it this way, who felt boxed in by some pretty tight guidelines that actually were issued by the president. It was not an unconstrained review. You know, it was, you shall find a way to reduce. You shall comport with a speech that I've already given before you have, you know, done this. So those are options that a president has, and he took them. I mean, I think the president had been advised, you don't want the bureaucracy to kind of run you down. So, I mean, he gave very clear guidance both in the speech and in the specific classified guidance that was detailed and basically told us what we could and couldn't do. And I don't think that's necessarily bad if you're a president that's coming in and says, this is an important agenda item for me, I have a personal agenda and I want to see if I can do that, but I want to do it in a way that I can maintain the support across my cabinet, that I can meet my security needs. So, I mean, it wasn't, you know, off the rails in some way, but it was very directive. So this is kind of interesting because it's not clear. There doesn't seem to be a lot of specific directive, or that the directives tend to be kind of broad. So it'll be interesting to see. The one other thing I would say that was very difficult in that review, but I still think was worthwhile, is that the 2010 NPR did have a lot of interagency and international conversation built into it. It was unwieldy to the point of painful, honestly, but there were benefits in that, especially in out talking to the allies. So I think that I'm wondering if there'll be a temptation in the current NPR to go, oh, we don't want to do all of that. We want to kind of keep this tight and narrow. And I understand that, but it will, you know, if you incorporate your stakeholders early, you're paying up front. If you push your stakeholders out of the process, you tend to pay later. I'm a pay up front kind of person. So that's just but you pay either way. So that's the other thing I would kind of keep an eye out for.
All right, let's thank our speaker.